God of grace, send forth your Holy Spirit to lead us into all truth. Amen. Amen. Bumper stickers. We all read them. Some of us have them. It is certainly one way we exercise our constitutional right to freedom of speech, whether seriously or tongue-in-cheek. Here are a few things that I have learned about Jesus reading bumper stickers. Jesus votes Republican. Jesus is a liberal. Jesus is pro-life. Jesus is a rebel. Jesus is pro-choice. Jesus is awesome. Jesus is a Democrat. Jesus disliked the righteous in his day too. There seems to be something about our human condition that wants to appeal to divine authority for justification. It somehow feels and sounds much more powerful when Jesus supports my cause, endorses my views, affirms my political leanings, supports my actions and my behaviors. After all, how can we be misguided and uninformed if Jesus is on our side? One popular phrase, WWJD, what would Jesus do, would suggest that by following this principle, we would know the right course of action. As if even the most complex and difficult aspects of our life challenges can be solved by doing what Jesus would do. And if it was only that easy. So please don't misunderstand me. I fully affirm that as Christians, we should think seriously and prayerfully about the teachings and the model of life that Jesus presents for us. It is actually a significant part of our spiritual growth and our spiritual formation to be guided by the teachings of Jesus. But I am also clear that the sound bites of popular contemporary religion do not adequately address the very real struggles and challenges of our humanness. Frankly, there are things that each of us face in our lives that we really may not have a clue about what Jesus would do. And so we trust the leading of the Spirit and the support of God's people to walk with us and to guide us in doing the best we know at the time. The passage in Matthew's Gospel today records for us one of those complex and complicated life challenges: paying taxes. I suspect that each of you here have some feelings about that. It was a hot issue in the time of Christ, and it is a hot issue today that generates strong rhetoric from all points of view. And so it is that Jesus finds himself pulled into the center of yet another religious and political debate. In chapters 21 and 22 of Matthew, we read of various accounts in which the Jewish authorities and religious leaders come to Jesus with questions that have both political and religious implications. Questions about his authority, questions about resurrection, questions about the law. And today, in our passage that was read for us in Matthew's Gospel, we have questions that come by the way of the Pharisees and the Herodians. A very unlikely association, by the way. Pharisees were the overseers of religious life within the Jewish community. They were the teachers of the Mosaic Law. And they were in tension with the Roman occupation and all that it stood for, including paying taxes to the emperor. Now the Herodians, on the other hand, represented the interest of Herod and other clients of Rome within Herod's circle. And as such, they were supportive of Roman occupation. So isn't it curious and interesting that representatives of both of these groups want to engage Jesus in what first appears to sound like a lose-lose situation? Yet in a respectful and diplomatic fashion, they first extol the virtues of Jesus' integrity and his commitment to truth and equality and lack of concern for the opinions of others. Sound familiar? Kind of how Congress starts, isn't it? Their question is short and to the point. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? The tax in question was the census tax. We don't really have anything that would relate to it in our current tax laws or codes. Neither our property taxes, our income taxes, nor our sales taxes are anywhere close to what this particular tax was intended to do. The census tax was a flat personal tax, taxed on all males 14 and above, and all females 12 and above. So even some inequity early on in history. And it was levied at the rate of 1 denarius a day, which was about, or 1 denarius a year, which was about the wages of 1 day's work. So the conundrum for Jesus was this, simply: if he answered yes, then he would be perceived as in collusion with Rome, justifying Roman occupation and persecution of the Jews. As you can tell, not a popular position to be in his own community. On the other hand, if he answered no, he would be suspected of revolutionary sentiment against the Roman occupation. And we see Jesus' response. He says, "Give me the coin, tell me whose face is on it, and what does it say?" And so they read it to him. And he says simply, "Give, therefore, to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." Sounds clear enough. But as with most of the sayings of Jesus, it is a statement that is packed and loaded with meaning and implications. Upon closer examination, the response Jesus provides is about far, far more than just paying taxes. Most biblical scholars agree on 2 interpretive elements of this passage. First, our modern separation of church and state, which this text is often employed to support, is just that, modern. It is highly unlikely that a devout Jew of the first century would imagine the clean separation of our lives into political and religious spheres that we embrace in American society today. Second, the coin likely had not only a likeness, an image of Caesar, but it also had the inscription, Son of God. For a faithful Jew to be in a possession of such a coin, in and of itself, was viewed as idolatry and a violation of the first 2 commandments. So here's the question for us to consider. Is Jesus saying that we owe nothing to a false god like Caesar and should reserve all things for God? Or is he inviting us to recognize that while we may in fact owe the emperors of the world some things, like taxes, we owe God other things, like our whole selves? Or is Jesus instead inviting us to avoid giving our allegiance to the material and temporal things of this world that our coins can buy, and telling us that our ultimate devotion is to God. As I wrestled with this text and the implications of it for my own life, and I would encourage you all to do the same, I am inclined to believe that Jesus is not advocating a full-scale retreat from the economic and political dimensions of our lives. But instead, I believe he is asking each of us to recognize that all of these things are part of God's divine economy. That is to say, I think Jesus invites us to think prayerfully and carefully about how all of our decisions and actions are made. What we buy, who we vote for, how we spend our time, the use of our gifts and talents, our relationship to creation, our understanding of social justice, our relationship to one another, I believe might be shaped by the confession that indeed the whole world is God's, and everything in it is God's, including us. What is it we mean when we say, all we are and all we have is a gift from God? Perhaps at its foundation, this passage is really a teaching on stewardship, about how we use all that we have and all that we are in service to God. The word that was translated in Jesus' response as give to the emperor is better translated as give back to the emperor. What is it that we are called then to give back to our community, to give back to our city, our state, to give back to our nation and to our world? You know, the truth and the reality is that we do benefit in some way from the efforts of governmental officials and the presence of a legitimate form of working government, whether we'd like to admit it or not. And so there is implied in Jesus' answer to his antagonist an obligation and even a responsibility to support those in authority when they are serving the greater good, by giving back when it is morally appropriate to do so. That too implies prayerful discernment and the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and another sermon for another day. Then there is the larger implication for us today. Whose image do we bear as Christians? Whose stamp is upon us? Our faith affirms that we are made in the image of God. And so what is it that we are called to give back to God, if not our very selves? The call of Jesus to each of us, I believe, is to live in wholehearted allegiance to God, yet still navigating all in our lives that often pull at that allegiance. And I affirm and acknowledge that such navigation is not easy. It requires the leading of the Spirit. It requires prayer. It requires the support of our Christian community. We would do well to seek God's wisdom and discernment as we desire to follow Jesus in a world full of competing and confusing influences. No one needs to remind us that our world is filled with very difficult and complex problems. The answers and responses to those issues are often elusive to us. One example, this particular month of October is the month that has been designated to heighten our awareness around domestic violence. To be reminded that there are individuals who live in fear within their own homes and within their own families, who are hurt physically, emotionally, or verbally by people they know and love. What would Jesus do on this issue? I think we already know. It doesn't take much discernment or prayer to figure out that we are called to be part of the solution and support for those who experience such violence. Cherie will talk more about that in a bit. By the way, I haven't read too many bumper stickers on that issue. Jesus is the source of God's wisdom, the wisdom that calls us to give ourselves back. To give ourselves back that we might live fully into the great commandment, to love God and to love our neighbor in thought, in word, in deed. And so may God's amazing grace be the inspiration that would lead us to our better selves as we serve God and one another.